Welcome to this online lesson on the Tet Offensive 1968, the end of the Vietcong or the end of US hopes. Our aims today are to know the events of the Tet Offensive, to explain how the Tet Offensive weakened the VC and public support for the war in the USA, and to evaluate the extent to which public opinion was changed by the Tet Offensive. As a starter then, the following are all needed to keep the USA in the fight in Vietnam. Place them in order of importance based upon your opinion. Troops to fight in the war, money to pay for the war, public support for the war. There's no wrong or right answer to this, just give it some thought and note down your thoughts now. Pause the video, and then when you're done, press play and we'll continue. Done? Alright, let's move on. Let's consider some keywords and terms. Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today includes offensive. In this particular context, that means in military terms, a planned large-scale attack. Secondly, Tet. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year holiday and one of the most important festivals in Vietnam. Thirdly, embassy. This is a building that acts as a base for a nation, e.g. the US Embassy in Saigon was effectively a bit of US territory in South Vietnam. Other uses for the word embassy in the GCSE course include the use of Harold Godwinson's embassy in the Normans and Saxons topic, in which Harold Godwinson was sent on a mission by King Edward the Confessor. Consider its similarities to the modern use of the term embassy, where a country sends ambassadors out to other countries on a mission of diplomatic relations with those countries. Your tasks then, firstly, record the key terms and their meanings. And secondly, would an attack on the US Embassy count as an attack on the USA itself? Give that some thought. Pause the video now. Are we done? Well, let's consider that second point. One of the things that can happen in the world, and it indeed happens in this day and age too, is that countries can attack another country's embassy if they want to cause it an insult. But this is often not done by formal governments who would realise the seriousness of this, but by people who want to rebel or show a protest against that country's foreign policy. In recent years, for example, the American embassy in Libya was attacked, and this was a very controversial and devastating news item for people of the United States. From some points of view, then yes, an attack on a country's embassy can be considered an attack on that country itself. Let's move on. Let's consider why search and destroy tactics in the Vietnam War didn't work. If you've already done my lesson on search and destroy tactics in the Vietnam War, then you can consider this slide revision, but feel free to skip the tasks at the end. Here's a typical outline of a search and destroy operation. A first wave of search and destroy missions might be launched by the US, by ARVN, or by a combination of the two. In that operation, they might kill 1,100 Vietcong fighters. This is a ballpark figure for a reasonably large search and destroy operation. US troops would also destroy Vietcong hideouts, although collateral damage to civilian property was also possible. At the end of it, 100 US or ARVN soldiers might have been killed, so the USA feels that it can declare victory. Generals like Westmoreland often looked at the body count of the enemy Vietcong soldiers as the main means of declaring victory. Generals like Westmoreland had been trained during the Second World War and during the Korean War. As a result of this, one of the main ways of judging victory was as long as you lost fewer men than your enemy did, then you were probably still winning. Unfortunately, in Vietnam, this didn't really work, as we'll see. After the operation concludes, this is what happens next. Once the US troops leave, the Vietcong go back into the area that had just been cleared, so that process may well need to be repeated. Not only that, ordinary villagers were often harmed in the destruction of the Vietcong hideouts, or just simply harmed by indiscriminate burning down and destruction of villages, making support for the US and the South Vietnamese even weaker. The villagers often became refugees, either deliberately evacuated by US forces, or they are fleeing the bombing in so-called free fire zones as the Americans decide to try and combat the Vietcong who are moving back into the Vietcong-controlled areas. The result being then that even after a search and destroy mission, the USA might be no closer to winning the conflict. So some tasks to go with that. If you've not done so already, you may want to note down this diagram as a way of understanding the process of search and destroy. Firstly, describe why US commanders like Westmoreland thought search and destroy worked. Secondly, give 2 to 3 reasons why search and destroy didn't work. And then thirdly, using point example explain to explain your answer, why search and destroy was such an unsuccessful tactic. Pause the video now if you want to do that. Finished? Right, let's move on to the main focus of today's lesson. What was the Tet Offensive? The Tet Offensive was launched by the Vietcong in South Vietnam, particularly in Saigon, which is the capital of the South Vietnamese Republic, and the city of Hue on the 30th of January 1968, right at the start of the Vietnamese New Year celebrations. It was also launched in combination with support from the North Vietnamese army supporting the Vietcong as well. It was launched to coincide with the Tet celebrations, as many of the ARVN troops would have been on leave visiting their families for the New Year celebrations. In previous years, both sides had informally respected this as a sort of period of truce, a little bit like the Christmas truce of World War I, where both sides respected this New Year celebration. They expected that neither side would fight each other. Unfortunately for the South Vietnamese, that wasn't going to be the case in 1968. It involved 84,000 Vietcong and North Vietnamese troops in an all-out attack. This was very different to the usual hit-and-run guerrilla warfare tactics of the Vietcong. It is one of the only occasions in which the Vietcong launched an all-out, full-scale offensive against the Americans and against ARVN. It was launched at the same time as a major battle against the Americans at Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh Air Base was near to the demilitarised zone in the north of the country, and US Marines and others were desperately holding on to Khe Sanh and trying to beat the Vietcong and North Vietnamese soldiers in a battle of attrition there. There are certain parallels with what happened to the French in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, although the results at Khe Sanh were far more mixed for the Americans. Westmoreland had sent 6,000 reinforcements to Khe Sanh, which had left Saigon less well defended. Lastly, the US and ARVN were caught completely by surprise. Consider this again. They weren't expecting an attack because it was the Vietnamese New Year. They weren't expecting an all-out offensive because this was not the normal way that the Vietcong fought. And they'd already sent soldiers north to Khe Sanh, and so were less prepared when the offensive came. Your tasks then. Give examples that show why the US and ARVN forces were surprised. And secondly, how is this attack different to previous guerrilla tactics? Answer those questions now and pause the video. Once you're done, we'll move on. Finished? Alright, let's move on. Let's consider the outcomes of the Tet Offensive. On the one side, I'm going to show what might be considered Vietcong victories, and on the other side, I'm going to show what might be considered American or ARVN victories. Firstly, the Vietcong quickly captured parts of Saigon, including, and most embarrassingly for the Americans, the US Embassy was briefly invaded by Vietcong fighters. However, the US and ARVN forces quickly retook Saigon. Those that got into the compound of the American Embassy were all killed. The historic city of Hue fell to the Vietcong. This ancient fortress city was very symbolic to the people of Vietnam. After a costly 3-week battle, Hue was recaptured by US and ARVN forces. Khe Sanh Air Base came under even more intense attack. The defending US forces there held on. With 84,000 troops, this was the biggest VC attack ever. It really showed that they were capable of organising a large-scale offensive. However, an estimated 58,000 Vietcong were killed. While they were backed up by North Vietnamese soldiers as well, you can see that this is a huge proportion of their fighting strength simply wiped out. The effect was devastating for the Vietcong. Your tasks then. The Vietcong were virtually wiped out as a fighting force. Explain why this makes the Tet Offensive a Vietcong defeat. Use point example explain. And I've noticed another typo there. That's annoying, but even teachers make mistakes. Secondly, an extension. Are there any ways the offensive can be considered a US or ARVN failure? Again, use point example explain to explain this. If you wanted an extension, you could simply note down these facts for your revision notes. Pause the video now and then press play when you're ready to continue. Finished? Alright. Well, one of the things that might make this a Vietcong defeat is simply the huge numbers killed. That's quite a simple task. But is it an US and ARVN failure? Well, the fact it was able to happen at all shows that they weren't prepared for the attack in the way that perhaps they were. Perhaps by 1968 this shows a certain amount of carelessness and complacency creeping into the way that the US and ARVN were operating. They thought that their enemy was predictable, and the Tet Offensive proved anything but. How might Tet have been a US defeat? Let's consider 3 impacts on the USA of the Tet Offensive of 1968. Firstly, the effects on US politicians. There was a growing anti-war feeling. Congress was therefore less likely to want to fund the war going forward. Crucially, President Johnson decided not to run for president in 1968. This was mainly because of the Tet Offensive. This was particularly crucial given his earlier role in escalating the war in 1964 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Also, Congress divided between hawks and doves. Hawks were those who supported the war, and doves were those who were against it. This made finding agreement over the war even more difficult in US Congress. Secondly, the effect on the US Army. Let's not forget that the US Army with ARVN had managed to comprehensively defeat the Tet Offensive. This meant that US generals like General Westmoreland felt that they could argue that they could win the war if they were given more troops, but this was a controversial idea. And some had felt that the ARVN had done well, so the USA might actually be able to leave South Vietnam and let ARVN look after its own defences and its own security. Whether this was true would later be put to the test. Lastly, the effect upon the US public. They felt cheated by the US government, who had claimed that the war might end. They had been shocked by images of the Vietcong fighters inside the US Embassy compound, and there was a huge rise in opposition to the war. For years, the American public had been told that this war was being won and that it would be over soon. The images from the Tet Offensive, regardless of the fact that the Vietcong were defeated, convinced many Americans that this was a war that simply couldn't be won. One of the most respected news correspondents in America, a man who reported for CBS News, Walter Cronkite, made the argument that the Vietnam War was not being won. His word was one that many American people trusted, and it had a serious impact on support for the war. Now some tasks. Make some notes based upon these 3 effects on the USA. Secondly, which effect do you consider the most important? Is it the effect on the politicians? Is it the effect on the army? Or is it effect on the US public? Explain your choice using point, example, explain. The US military considered Tet a victory. Why didn't the public and some politicians agree? Use examples from earlier in the lesson or from your own knowledge, as well as what you can see on this slide. Pause the video now and then press play when you're ready to continue. Done? Alright, well, let's consider. Question 2 is very much a matter of your own opinion, so I'll leave that to you. However, question 3, about the US military considering Tet a victory but others not, really is a basis on the perspective that each had. The US Army was actually fighting the Vietcong in the South Vietnamese cities and in the jungles of South Vietnam as well. They were seeing the Vietcong getting weaker, and they were there seeing the destruction being dealt out to them. However, the perspective of the US public was very much shaped by the media and by the knowledge that their young men were going out there, fighting and dying. Remember as well that the war had been going on from this point for many years. American involvement had really ramped up from 1964, and 4 years later, a certain amount of war weariness was beginning to creep in. Also, when it comes to the US politicians, they were the ones who were going to be funding the continuing fighting. If they decided en masse to turn against the war, there wouldn't be any funding for the fighting, and American involvement in the Vietnam War would simply come to an end. Let's consider in more detail another aspect of the American public reaction to the Tet Offensive. This is one of a series of iconic images and indeed video footage of a famous event that happened after the Tet Offensive. It shows a man called Nguyễn Văn Lém. He's in the check shirt in the middle. He was a Vietcong fighter who was captured in the fighting in Saigon during the Tet Offensive. Notice that surrounding him are soldiers. These soldiers are working for the Saigon Security Forces, the Saigon Police, and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. They are not actually American soldiers. Notice that one of the soldiers holds his hand up. There's good reason for this. Notice to the right that there is the end of a camera lens. Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams was recording images of this event, and this soldier clearly didn't want to be identified. Perhaps he was afraid of reprisals given what was going to happen next. What follows is one of the most famous images for the entire Vietnam War. While it's not particularly graphic in itself, once it's described to you what's happening, it is pretty shocking, so just be prepared for that. Nguyễn Văn Lém was taken to one of the Saigon police chiefs. Here, rather than holding a trial or taking him prisoner as a prisoner of war, he simply drew his revolver, put it to the temple of Nguyễn Văn Lém and pulled the trigger. This incredible photograph shows the very instant that the bullet entered Nguyễn Văn Lém's head, and before it even exited the other side, blowing his brains out. Yes, that is very unpleasant, but so is war. Notice on the left the look of shock and disgust on the face of one of the ARVN soldiers. This shocked the American public for several reasons. First of all, they were meant to be, effectively, the goodies in this war, as were the South Vietnamese. And here, right in public view, is a brutal execution without trial. This is contrary to most Americans' ideas of fair play and how you are supposed to treat people, even your enemies. It also showed the brutality of the South Vietnamese government. Whereas some might say this is justified in defending themselves against the Vietcong, the fact that it looked so bad on the newsreels means that, well, it was only going to do harm to their reputation. Accompanying this was actually video footage of this event happening as well, which again was played on the American news broadcasts and caused quite a lot of shock. Remember, the media's portrayal of events in Vietnam is really important. Unlike in World War II, where media was very heavily censored and very much supporting the war effort, the media in the Vietnam War was so much more able to be uncensored and to give a more balanced or even honest view of what was going on there. In fact, it has been argued that some news reports took an actively anti-war stance. This can only have had an effect on American civilian attitudes to the war and what was going on, in combination with the suffering that they saw and the suffering of families who had lost loved ones in that conflict. Here is just yet another image that really emphasises that point. So to conclude, finally, was the US becoming war weary? Consider these statistics for the year 1968. The American government spent $26,266 million on the war. That's a colossal sum of money today, let alone in 1968. Over 500,000 troops were now in South Vietnam, 536,100. Then consider the grim death toll, 16,899 dead. Compare that to 1964, when only 216 Americans had been killed. Consider these statistics. Explain why the US public were becoming fed up with the war, supported by at least one of these statistics below. You may also want to link this to the Tet Offensive itself. Why was the Tet Offensive such a good example of the American public losing patience with a war that seemed increasingly more impossible to win? I hope that this has been useful to you, and there will be more content like it soon. If you've enjoyed it or found it useful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. And on that note, I'll say goodbye.